You don't want to see what's underneath, she said. And the mountain man looked her in the eye and answered, show me everything. The snow was coming down heavy in the high country, thick flakes swallowing the world in white. Inside the cabin, lamplight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. Sandro stood frozen, his scarred hands gripping the back of a wooden chair he'd been about to sit in. The sound from below came again, a soft shuffle, a muffled scrape against wood, and then a dead silence that was louder than any noise. The woman's eyes, Kathy's eyes, were dark pools of fear. They met his across the small room. Please, she whispered, the word barely a breath. He's all I have left. Sandra's throat went tight. He knew that sound. It was the ragged edge of a mother's desperation, the kind that would move mountains or burn the world down. He'd heard it once before, in the smoke and the flames, a long time ago. Slowly, making sure his every move was visible, he stepped away from the trap door in the floor. He settled into the chair, the wood groaning under his weight. He kept his hands in sight, open on the rough-hewn table. How old? He asked, his voice a low rumble. 8 summers, she said, her fingers twisting the worn fabric of her shawl. His name is Samuel. A gust of wind howled outside, rattling the single window pane. The snow was already piling up against the log walls, but the iron stove in the corner radiated a steady, defiant heat. Sandra watched her face in that warm glow. The scars that traced a cruel map across her skin told one story, a story of violence and pain. But the steel in her spine, the way she held her chin up, even as her eyes darted to the trap door, that told another story entirely, a story of survival. Reckon he's mighty cold down there, Sandro said, his voice carefully neutral. And hungry too, I'll warrant. Her shoulders tensed, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. We've managed. No doubt they had, but managing wasn't living. Sandro stood slowly, his movements deliberate. He saw how she shifted her body, a subtle, unconscious move to keep herself between him and the hidden door. There's soup warming on the stove, he said, turning his back to her, an act of trust. And I've got cornbread from yesterday. He moved to the crude cupboard, his voice filling the tense silence as he worked. My mama taught me never to let anyone go hungry in my home. She said a full belly is the first step to a mended spirit. A flicker of surprise, of something less guarded, crossed Kathy's face. Your mother? Creek woman, he said simply, setting 2 tin bowls on the table with a soft clink. Taught me more than just cooking. Taught me to see the person, not the skin they're in. He ladled the thick bean soup into the bowls, steam rising in fragrant clouds. He added a generous chunk of cornbread to each plate, then stepped back, leaving a clear path to the table. There's plenty more, he said, and the words meant more than just food. Understanding dawned in her eyes. He wasn't just offering a meal. He was offering a sanctuary. She knelt beside the trap door, her back still to him, and tapped twice on the wooden planks. A secret signal. Samuel, she called, her voice soft now, reassuring. You can come up. It's safe. The trap door lifted a few inches. Then a small face, pale and thin, peered out into the lamplight. The boy's eyes were huge and weary, but they darted around the room with a wild, intelligent quickness. He climbed out with the silent grace of a forest creature, someone used to moving without a sound. He stayed glued to his mother's side, a small shadow in the flickering light. Evening, Samuel, Sandro said, keeping his voice gentle, the way you'd talk to a spooked colt. Mighty cold night to be under the floorboards. The boy didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the steaming bowls of soup. He was starving. Sandro pulled out chairs for both of them, then retreated to his own seat by the stove, giving them space. He watched as Kathy guided her son to the table. He noticed she took the first spoonful of soup herself, a small, quick taste, before she let Samuel eat. A mother's caution, the poison taster. Samuel ate carefully at first, his movements small and precise. Then as the warmth spread through him, hunger took over. He ate with a desperate speed that made Sandro's chest ache. Kathy ate more slowly, her eyes constantly moving, from her son to Sandro, to the shuttered window, to the barred door. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against tin. When Samuel's bowl was empty, Sandro rose without a word and ladled more soup into it. The boy froze, looking to his mother. She gave a slight nod, and he began to eat again, slower this time. He paused between bites, studying Sandro's face in the lamplight. "Your face," Samuel said suddenly, his voice small but clear, making both adults jump. "It's like Mama's." "Samuel," Kathy warned, her voice sharp with fear. But Sandro held up a hand, the scarred skin pulling tight. "It's all right," he said, his voice raspy. "He's right. We both carry our stories on our skin." He touched the rippled scar tissue that covered the left side of his face, a permanent mask of pain. "Mine came from a fire, 5 years back. Lost my cabin, my family. Lost most everything in it." Samuel nodded, his expression solemn. "We lost things too." He glanced at his mother, a silent question in his eyes, then looked down at his bowl. "But Mama says what matters most is still here." "Your mama's a wise woman," Sandro said, reaching for the coffee pot. He poured a cup for Kathy, the dark liquid steaming in the cold air. "And she's right. Things can be rebuilt." Kathy wrapped her hands around the warm tin cup, her fingers trembling. "Some things can't," she whispered. "No," Sandro agreed quietly, his own ghost stirring in the shadows. "But new things can grow in their place. Stronger things." He stood, moving to add another log to the stove, the action giving him a moment to collect himself. "Storm's setting in hard. You'll stay the night." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. But Kathy stiffened anyway, the hunted look returning to her eyes. "We shouldn't. We'll bring trouble." "Mama," Samuel's voice cut through the tension, small but surprisingly firm. "I'm tired of running." The words hung in the air like frost, stark and painful. Kathy's face crumpled for a heartbeat, a universe of exhaustion and sorrow passing over it, before she locked it down again. Sandro busied himself with the fire, giving her the privacy of his back. "There's a bed in the back room," he said, his voice gruff. "Clean blankets, too. I'll sleep out here by the stove." She started to protest, but he cut her off. "Gotta keep the fire going anyway with weather like this. No sense in all of us being cold." Samuel let out a huge yawn, his small body finally succumbing to the warmth in the full belly. Kathy's resistance crumbled. "Just for tonight," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll be gone before dawn." Sandro nodded, though a strange pang went through his chest at the thought. He showed them to the small back room, little more than a closet with a narrow cot. He brought extra blankets and a spare wool shirt for Samuel to sleep in. The boy was already half asleep on his feet, the simple comforts of food and shelter doing what weeks of fear and cold had not allowed. As Kathy tucked her son into the bed, Sandro lingered in the doorway. "Coffee's still hot," he offered, "if you'd like to sit a spell." She hesitated, her gaze fixed on Samuel's peaceful face. For the first time in what was probably a very long time, her son looked like a child, not a fugitive. She nodded and followed Sandro back to the main room. They settled in the chairs by the stove again. The steam from their coffee cups rose between them like a silent conversation. "Whatever you're running from," Sandro said carefully, not looking at her, just staring into the flames, "it won't find you here tonight." Kathy's hands tightened around her cup. "You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "But I know these mountains, know every trail and every hollow, know how to keep what's mine safe." He turned then, and his eyes, deep set in his scarred face, met hers. "And tonight, that includes you and Samuel." The lamp guttered, and for a moment his face was all shadows. Outside, the wind howled a lonely song through the pines. But inside, something fragile and warm was beginning to take root in the frozen ground of two broken lives. Something that felt dangerously like hope. He knelt by the trap door again, the worn iron handle cold in his hand. Lamplight spilled into the root cellar, revealing the small, huddled shape. Samuel, wrapped in threadbare blankets, a half-eaten biscuit, hard as a rock, lying beside him. The boy's eyes were wide, darting from Sandro to his mother. A trapped rabbit. "It's all right, son," Sandro said softly. He pulled a strip of jerky from his vest. "Reckon you're hungry for more than old biscuits." Kathy knelt by the opening. "Samuel," she whispered, "come up where it's warm." The boy hesitated, his eyes fixed on Sandro's scarred face. Then slowly he climbed the ladder, taking the jerky with trembling fingers. "Thank you, sir." "Call me Sandro," he said, closing the door on the dark hole. He ladled soup into bowls. As they sat at the table, Kathy's voice came, quiet but steady. "The townsman. They call him illegitimate." Her arm tightened around Samuel's shoulders. "They say my marriage wasn't proper. That's why we hide." Sandro's jaw clenched, but his voice stayed calm. "Proper enough for me," he said, pushing a bowl toward her. "Eat while it's hot." The wind howled. Snow beat against the windows. As Samuel ate, some color returned to his cheeks. Kathy stirred her soup, gathering her courage. "My husband," she began, "was a scout for the army at Fort Garland. Apache, like my mother's people. He believed in building bridges." Sandro nodded. He'd heard of the native scouts, men who walked between two worlds and were trusted by neither. "Before he died," she continued, her hand going to her chest, "he signed a treaty. It promised our people water rights at Canyon Spring." She pulled out an oilskin packet. "I carry the deed. It's all we have left of him." Her voice hardened. "Sheriff Drummond says I have no right to it. Says a half-breed woman can't hold treaty land. He and the soldiers from the fort, they've been hunting us since autumn." Samuel looked up, fear creeping back into his eyes. "They hurt Mama," he whispered, "when they found us at the mission." Sandro's hand tightened on his spoon. He kept his voice steady for the boy. "You're safe here," he said, the words a promise. "Both of you." The fire crackled. Samuel's eyes were growing heavy. "You'll stay the night," Sandro said again. It wasn't a question. "Weather's too fierce." Kathy started to protest, her face a mask of worry. "If they track us here—" "Then they'll find more than they bargained for," Sandro interrupted. "I know these mountains better than any soldier, and I don't take kindly to men who hunt women and children." He stood, pulling blankets from a chest. "The boy needs real sleep, not in a root cellar." Samuel was already swaying with exhaustion. Kathy looked from her son to the mountain man, a silent battle raging in her eyes. Finally, she nodded. "Just for tonight." Sandro laid the bedding near the hearth. The boy curled up like a wolf pup, asleep almost instantly. Kathy sat beside him, stroking his hair. "Get some rest," Sandro told her. "I'll keep watch." She looked at him for a long moment, the firelight dancing in her dark eyes. "Why are you helping us?" He touched the scars on his face. "Because someone once helped me," he said simply, "when I had nothing left but burns and bitter memories." She nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between them. Soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Sandro sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, and watched the snow fall. Dawn was a long way off, and it was bringing trouble. Morning crept over the mountains, pale and brittle. Frost laced the windows with delicate, icy ferns. Sandro stood at the door, studying the blanket of fresh snow. No tracks. Not yet. He grabbed his traps from the shed, the cold steel biting through his gloves. As he headed for the tree line, he heard small crunches in the snow behind him. Samuel. The boy followed, wrapped in an old wool blanket, his eyes bright with a cautious curiosity. "Want to learn about trapping?" Sandro asked, slowing his pace. Samuel nodded, his breath making small, white clouds. "Mama says we need to learn to provide for ourselves." "Your mama's a wise woman." Sandro knelt, showing the boy how to set the first snare. "You place it where the animals travel, along these fallen logs." Samuel watched, his small face serious with concentration. They worked their way along the edge of the forest, the hermit and the boy, moving through the silent, white world. When they returned, the smell of cooking corn cakes greeted them. Kathy stood at the stove, her shawl pulled tight. "It's not much," she said, "but it's what I can offer in return." Before they ate, she drew Samuel close and spoke softly in Apache, teaching him a prayer of thanks. The musical words filled the small cabin, a language Sandro didn't understand, but a reverence he felt deep in his bones. The peace was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. Hoofbeats, sharp and rhythmic, coming up the ridge. Sandro was at the window in an instant, his rifle in his hand. "Under the bed, Samuel. Quiet as a mouse." The boy vanished. 4 riders came into view. 3 in the blue uniforms of Fort Garland. The fourth was Sheriff Drummond, his badge glinting in the pale sun. Sandro stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready but not aimed. The morning light threw his scars into stark relief. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice even. "Long ride from town." Drummond spat into the snow. "Save it, Harker. We're here for the woman and her brat." "The lady you're referring to is under my protection," Sandro said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is my property. You have no cause to be here without a warrant." One of the soldiers shifted. "That woman's carrying stolen property. Army business." "I stole nothing." Kathy's voice came from the doorway, trembling but strong. "The treaty deed was my husband's. It's mine by right." "Rights?" Drummond laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You've got no rights here, woman. Hand over that paper, or face the consequences." Sandro took a step forward, planting himself between them and Kathy. "Seems to me this could be settled in a court, not at gunpoint on my land." "You defending her, Harker?" Drummond's hand drifted to his pistol. "Didn't figure you for an Indian lover." "I'm defending the law," Sandro replied. "The same law you're sworn to uphold. Now, unless you have a warrant, I suggest you ride back down this mountain." The standoff stretched. The air was tight, cold. Sandro's finger rested beside the trigger. He could feel Kathy behind him, solid as a rock. Finally, Drummond yanked his reins. "This ain't over, Harker. We'll be back, and then neither your scars nor your rifle will stop us." They wheeled their horses and galloped away, leaving churned snow and threats hanging in the air. Sandro didn't lower his rifle until they were gone. Inside, Samuel crawled out from under the bed. Kathy gathered him close, whispering in Apache. Sandro moved quickly, grabbing boards and nails. He began barricading the windows, securing the door. Every hammer blow was a declaration. Every nail was a vow. This was his mountain, and they were his to protect. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace under the shadow of a coming storm. The weather softened. The deep cold gave way to a gentle thaw, water dripping from the pine branches like a ticking clock. Sandro took Samuel out each morning, teaching him not just how to set traps, but how to read the forest, how to listen to the wind. One morning, as they were setting a rabbit snare, Samuel finally got the loop just right. A sound burst from him that startled them both. Laughter, bright and clear and loud. It echoed in the quiet woods, a sound of pure, unburdened childhood. Sandro found himself smiling, the unfamiliar expression pulling at his scars. From the cabin doorway, Kathy watched them, a small, tentative smile on her own face. The rigid fear in her posture had begun to soften. That evening, over a supper of stewed rabbit, Sandro finally asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Tell me about this spring, Canyon Spring." Kathy's hand stilled. "It has been sacred to my mother's people since before the Spanish came," she said, her voice soft but clear. "The water flows year-round, clean and sweet. It gives life to the entire canyon. But now the settlers want it for their cattle. They say the treaty means nothing because because Samuel's father is gone." She reached beneath her clothes and pulled out the oilskin packet. She unfolded the treaty on the table. Sandro leaned in, studying the formal script. His eyes landed on a signature at the bottom. "Colonel James Barrett." "I knew Barrett," he said quietly. "Served under him. He was a man of his word. If he signed this, he meant it to stand." "The sheriff claims it's worthless," she whispered. The lamp cast a warm glow as Kathy began to hum an Apache lullaby. Samuel leaned against her, his eyes heavy. Watching them, Sandro felt a pang of something he'd thought was buried forever. The ghost of family. After Samuel was asleep by the fire, they sat in the quiet. "The fire that marked me," Sandro said, the words heavy, tasting of ash. "It took more than my skin. I lost my wife, my little girl. Couldn't save them." His throat closed up. "Came up here to hide from my own face." Kathy nodded, her own dark eyes full of a terrible understanding. "We both hide," she whispered. Her hand touched her shawl, a gesture of habit, then dropped away. "My scars. They're from the night they killed my husband. I fought back." A flicker of fierce pride crossed her face, followed by a shadow of old pain. But sometimes, I still feel their hands. They sat in silence, the weight of their shared wounds settling between them. It wasn't pity, it was recognition, a bond forged in fire and survival. Samuel stirred in his sleep, and Kathy smoothed his hair. Sandro moved to the window, his rifle across his knees. His reflection stared back from the dark glass, the scars stark and clear. But for the first time in 5 years, he didn't flinch. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was standing watch, and he wasn't alone. One frosty morning, hoofbeats sounded on the path again. Sandro grabbed his rifle, but the approaching rider was alone, a man in a black coat, the Reverend Josiah Miles. "Morning, Sandro," the preacher called, his eyes moving past him to Kathy in the doorway. Recognition flickered on his face, followed by a deep, abiding shame. "Sister Kathy," he said, his voice catching, "I hadn't thought to find you here." An old hurt hung in the air between them. Inside, the preacher twisted his hat in his hands. "I need to speak with Kathy alone," he said. Sandro took Samuel outside to check the snares. When the door closed, the preacher seemed to shrink. "I owe you an apology," he began. "After your husband died, you came to me, asking for baptism. I christened you in the creek at midnight, like some shameful thing. And when the town turned on you, I stayed silent. I was afraid." Kathy's face was a stone mask. "I forgive you, Reverend," she said, her voice tight. "Not for you, for myself, and for my son." Relief washed over the preacher's face, but the guilt remained. "That's not all," he said, reaching into his coat. "I've heard the talk. The sheriff means to claim the spring. He says you have no proof." He leaned forward. "Bring the treaty to town. Let me help you. My testimony, it might be enough." That night the adults spoke in low voices. "It's too dangerous," Kathy insisted. "The sheriff is counting on our fear to keep us silent," Sandra argued. "The Reverend's right. We can't hide forever." "You don't understand," Kathy's voice cracked. "My husband trusted their promises. His blood soaked into the ground while they watched." "This time will be different," Reverend Miles said quietly. "I will not be silent again." Outside, a wolf howled, a long, lonely cry. Kathy looked at her sleeping son. "If we do nothing," she whispered, "he'll inherit only hiding." She looked at Sandro, her eyes searching his. "You're not hiding anymore," he said gently. "Neither am I." A decision was made. They would go to town. As the first pale light of dawn touched the mountains, Sandro was in the barn, saddling his horse. From the cabin doorway, Kathy's voice came, soft and bitter as she watched him. "Look, Samuel," she murmured to her son, who was still half asleep. "Once again, men will choose sides against us." Her arms tightened around the boy. The rising sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. A beautiful morning for a battle. The trail down the mountain was slick with melting snow. Sandro led the way, his eyes constantly scanning the trees. Kathy followed. Samuel held tight against her chest. As they neared the town, faces appeared in windows. A woman sweeping her porch froze. Men loading a wagon stopped to stare and whisper. "That's the Apache woman. What's Harker doing with her kind?" Kathy kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but Sandro saw her spine stiffen. They reached the sheriff's office. Drummond was behind his desk, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. He looked up and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. "Well, well," he drawled. "Come to surrender." "Come to claim what's rightful," Sandro said. "Kathy holds a legal treaty for Canyon Spring." Drummond laughed. "That worthless piece of paper?" Just then the door opened. Reverend Miles stepped inside. "The congregation is gathered at the church," the preacher announced. "They're waiting to see justice done." Drummond's face darkened, but he was trapped. He couldn't refuse in front of the preacher. "Fine," he growled. "Let's see this famous treaty." The church was packed. Every pew was filled with curious, hostile, and uncertain faces. Kathy walked to the pulpit, her steps echoing in the silence. Her hands trembled as she withdrew the oilskin packet and held up the treaty. "This was signed by Colonel James Matthews," she said, her voice gaining strength. "It guarantees the water rights of Canyon Spring to my husband's people." A murmur went through the crowd. Reverend Miles stepped forward. "The colonel's signature is genuine," he confirmed, "and the seal is authentic." Before he could say more, the church doors burst open. Soldiers poured in, rifles ready. Drummond stood in the doorway, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Seize that paper," he ordered. "It's evidence in a fraud investigation." A soldier wrenched the treaty from Kathy's grasp. Another shoved her aside. Sandro lunged forward, rage contorting his scarred face. "You have no right." A rifle butt caught him across the temple. He staggered, blood streaming down his face. "Mama!" Samuel's terrified cry cut through the chaos. Drummond grabbed the boy by the collar. "Kathy Yazy," Drummond announced, "you're under arrest for trespassing and fraud." The boy, too. The congregation erupted. "This isn't right," Reverend Miles shouted. "Was it?" Drummond sneered. The soldier who had taken the treaty was gone. It had simply vanished. Two more soldiers grabbed Kathy, dragging her toward the door. "Stop this!" Sandro yelled, but another blow sent him sprawling. "Get him out of here," Drummond ordered. Rough hands hauled Sandro through the doors. He looked up just in time to see a wagon rattling away, Kathy and Samuel visible through the wooden slats. "Kathy!" he cried out. "I'll find you, I swear it!" The wagon disappeared. Sandro sagged against a post, his blood dripping onto the snow. The townspeople hurried past, avoiding his eyes. The hope of the morning had turned to ash. Night fell, cold and black. Sandro lay where he'd fallen until a hand touched his shoulder. Reverend Miles. "Let me help you," the preacher said, his voice thick with shame. At the parsonage, as the Reverend's wife cleaned his wound, Miles paced the floor. "I should have spoken sooner," he lamented. "I kept quiet." "You're speaking now," Sandro said, his voice a raw rasp. "That's what matters." Miles stopped pacing. "There's more." He rushed from the room and returned with a thick, leather-bound book. "My church ledger," he said, his hands trembling. "I kept copies of certain documents, treaty records, witness statements, even a copy of Colonel Matthews' original survey map showing Canyon Spring on Apache territory." Sandro straightened, a new fire in his eyes. "Those papers, they could free them." "The fort commander is an honest man," Miles said. "If we show him these, prove the treaty was real, then we ride at first light," Sandro said, his voice like iron. In a cold cell at Fort Garland, Kathy held Samuel, who had cried himself to sleep. Through the small, barred window, she could see a sliver of the star-filled sky. She had lost the treaty, but they couldn't steal her husband's words. "This paper is our children's future." And they couldn't steal Sandro's promise. "I'll find you." She held on to those words as the long, cold night stretched on. The ride to Fort Garland was brutal. A snowstorm hit, forcing them to take shelter in an old line shack. Inside, by the warmth of a small stove, Miles opened the ledger. "Listen to this," he said, his finger tracing the elegant script. "I, Colonel James Matthews, do hereby affirm that the waters of Canyon Spring shall remain under their sovereignty in perpetuity." It's dated the same day as Kathy's treaty. Sandro stared into the flames. "Will it be enough?" "Truth usually is," Miles said. "But sometimes," Sandro replied quietly, "truth needs men willing to stand behind it." "I aim to stand this time," the preacher vowed. No more silence. They rode on, arriving at the fort as the storm cleared. They burst into the commander's office, where Kathy and a feverish Samuel were being questioned by a cold-eyed captain and a sneering lieutenant. "I demand to speak with the commanding officer," Sandro declared. "Sir," Miles said, stepping forward with the ledger, "I have documents that prove the legitimacy of Mrs. Yazy's claim." The captain, intrigued despite himself, examined the ledger. "Very well," he sighed. "We'll hold a proper hearing tomorrow morning, but they remain in custody." As Kathy and Samuel were led away, Sandro met her eyes. His gaze was a silent promise. "Hold on." The next morning, the fort's mess hall was packed. Kathy sat with Samuel, who leaned heavily against her, his face flushed with fever. Reverend Miles presented the ledger, reading aloud the survey descriptions, the witness statements, the clear and undeniable proof. The lieutenant interrupted. "This proves nothing about her rights. Where is the documentation of her marriage? Her inheritance? The crowd murmured. The weight of their doubt pressed down on Kathy. Slowly she stood. You want proof? She asked, her voice ringing through the suddenly silent room. Here is your proof. With steady hands she unwrapped her shawl. Gasps echoed as she revealed her scarred arms and shoulders. These marks, she said, her chin high, are from men who tried to drive us from our land. Men who thought they could shame me into running. I have nothing left to hide. I will not be silenced. The room was deathly quiet. Even the lieutenant looked away. My husband died protecting our rights to that spring, she continued, her voice softer now. I keep fighting for our son's future. Sandro stood, his scarred face a mask of fierce pride. The treaty is legal, he declared. The records prove it. Will you uphold the law, Captain? The captain's face was unreadable. This hearing is dismissed, he said finally. I will review the evidence. Just like that, it was over. But as Kathy and Samuel were led back to their cell, a change had occurred. The hostile stares were gone, replaced by troubled frowns and nods of respect. An old woman called out, God be with you. The truth was out, and it couldn't be put back in its box. That night, Sandro paced the floor of the parsonage. The captain won't be swayed by morals alone, Reverend Miles said. We need more voices. The ranchers, Sandro said suddenly, they water their herds at Canyon Spring. Exactly, Miles agreed. Self-interest might motivate them where conscience hasn't. They rode out at dawn, splitting up to visit the homesteads. Sandro found old Jim Henderson in his barn. Never thought much about that Apache woman's claim, the rancher admitted after hearing the story. But if the army takes over my water, count me in, I'll testify. It was the same at every ranch. The ranchers, realizing their own livelihoods were at stake, pledged their support. Meanwhile, in the cell, Samuel's condition worsened. A young guard, Private Wilson, risked sneaking them extra blankets. The town's talking, he whispered. Folks are seeing things different now. That evening, Reverend Miles rang the church bell. The pews filled not with a mob, but with a congregation. Ranchers stood beside merchants. Jim Henderson rose. We've been wrong, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Turning a blind eye. That spring belongs to all of us. The treaty made it so. Another rancher, Mary Crawford, stood. My conscience can't bear seeing that boy sick in a cell while we debate his mother's rights. It's time to make this right. One by one they stood. They would stand with her. The tide had turned. Back in her cell, Kathy held her feverish son, unaware of the revolution happening just beyond the fort's walls. But she could feel it, a shift in the air, a whisper of hope. The morning of the final hearing, a procession of wagons creaked toward the fort. The ranchers and the townspeople were coming. Inside the fort's main hall, the crowd was a sea of determined faces. Kathy entered, carrying a weak but conscious Samuel. The captain took his seat. Sandro presented the ledger again. Then Jim Henderson stood. Captain, that spring has sustained our herds for 15 years. The treaty protected everyone's access. One by one, the ranchers spoke, their words carrying the weight of the territory's economy. The sheriff, slouched against a wall, suddenly pushed off. This is foolishness, he barked. We're listening to ranchers defend a squaw and her brat. Before anyone could react, Kathy stood. She let her shawl fall to the floor. My husband fought for this country, she said, her voice clear and strong. He served as an Army scout. He bled for the trust between our peoples. When he signed this treaty, it was a covenant. Will the Army now break faith with a man who died in its service? The captain's face was a storm of conflict. The evidence was undeniable. The political pressure from the ranchers was immense, and Kathy's dignity was unshakable. This matter requires review by higher command, he began. That was all the sheriff needed to hear. He lunged forward, grabbing Kathy's arm. You're still under arrest. In a flash, Sandro was on him. His fist connected with the sheriff's jaw with a sickening crack. Chaos erupted. Soldiers rushed to separate them. Stand down, the captain roared. Sheriff Drummond, you will release Mrs. Yazy and her son to await review under town supervision. Under whose supervision? The sheriff demanded. Mine, said Mary Crawford, stepping forward. The captain nodded, relieved. The hearing was adjourned. They weren't free yet, but the wall of silence and shame had been shattered. But Samuel's fever returned with a vengeance. He lay shivering in their cell, his breathing shallow. Sandro brought the fort doctor, but the man refused to treat him. Prisoners receive basic care only, he said stiffly. Regulations. Regulations? Reverend Miles appeared, his voice sharp with anger. Would you deny medicine to any child? The doctor finally relented, passing willowbark tea through the bars. As Kathy administered the medicine, word of Samuel's illness spread through the town. A steady stream of people began arriving at the fort. Mrs. Henderson brought fresh bread. The Wilsons' daughter brought warm, knitted socks. The community that had once shunned them was now rallying to save her son. Their quiet pressure was more powerful than any army. Early the next morning, the fort commander, Colonel Harrison, appeared at their cell, an official document in his hand. Word has arrived from higher command, he announced. After reviewing the evidence, your claim is ruled lawful and binding. The United States Army will honor the treaty. A cheer erupted from the townspeople gathered in the corridor. The cell door swung open. They were free. As they stepped out, Kathy let her shawl fall away one last time. These scars, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power, are not marks of shame. They are a witness to survival. Then she saw the ruins. Sandro's cabin had been burned to the ground. Blackened timbers pointed to the sky like accusing fingers. The ranchers who had escorted them home muttered in anger, but Sandro just looked at the wreckage. We'll help you rebuild, Jim Henderson offered. Sandro nodded his thanks. Soon they were alone, the three of them, standing in the snow before the ashes. Samuel shivered, and Sandro wrapped his own coat around the boy. Kathy touched a scorched wall, then turned to Sandro, her eyes meeting his. They had both lost homes before. They had both risen from the ashes. We can build again, she said softly, holding out her hand. Together. He took it, his warm, strong fingers closing around hers. Together. Spring came to the mountains, and with it came the neighbors. Wagons creaked up the ridge, loaded with timber and supplies. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air as the community came together to rebuild the cabin. The walls rose stronger than before. Samuel, his health returned, played with the other children, his laughter echoing in the pines. One evening, after the others had gone, Sandro sat with Kathy by the fire. From his pocket, he pulled a small wooden ring carved with the image of mountain flowers. This cabin, he said, his voice quiet, it's meant for a family. I'd like it to be our family. Will you marry me, Kathy? Tears streamed down her face as she looked from the ring to his scarred, hopeful face. He had seen everything. Her pain, her fear, her strength, and he had not turned away. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. They were married in the small-town church, surrounded by the faces of their new community. They walked out into the brilliant spring sunshine, a family forged in fire, bound by courage, and ready to build a new life from the ashes of the old. That night, in their new home, Sandro turned to her, his face gentle in the lamplight. You've shown me everything, Kathy, he whispered. Your strength, your heart, your scars, and I choose to stay, today and all our days. She smiled, a deep peace settling in her soul. The cabin glowed around them, a sanctuary built not just of wood and stone, but of forgiveness, resilience, and love. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. And if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect, don't forget to subscribe.